Picture this: the queen who was so evil that her skin turned to coal before she died. We're talking about a woman whose skin literally turned black before she died, whose body rotted from the inside out, and who became so consumed with hatred and revenge that she burned nearly 300 people alive. But here's the plot twist that's going to blow your mind. This monster, this absolute nightmare of a human being, started out as the most innocent, most tragic victim you could possibly imagine. I'm talking about Mary Tudor, better known as Bloody Mary. And when I tell you this woman's life was a horror movie from start to finish, I am not exaggerating. This is the story of how a sweet little princess was systematically tortured, humiliated, and broken until she became the most feared ruler in English history. And when I say tortured, I don't mean metaphorically. I mean she was literally forced to empty her baby sister's chamber pot, beaten by servants, and psychologically destroyed for years until her mind completely snapped. But that's just the beginning. Because what happened to Mary Tudor is so dark, so twisted, so absolutely devastating that it makes every single episode of Game of Thrones look like a children's bedtime story. We're talking about phantom pregnancies that lasted 11 months, a husband who was so disgusted by her that he couldn't even fake affection, and a death so horrific that witnesses said her skin had turned to coal and the smell was unbearable from rooms away. So buckle up, because we're about to dive deep into the most tragic villain origin story in history, and I guarantee you that by the end of this video, you're going to understand exactly how an innocent little girl became the woman who literally burned people alive and felt good about it. This is going to be intense. Let's start from the very beginning, because Mary Tudor's nightmare began the moment she took her first breath. Picture this: it's February 18th, 1516, and Henry VIII is pacing around Greenwich Palace like a man possessed. His wife, Catherine of Aragon, has been in labor for hours, and Henry is convinced, absolutely convinced, that this time he's finally going to get his male heir. This is going to be the prince who saves the Tudor dynasty, the son who will make Henry's reign legendary. But then the midwives come out, and the look on their faces tells Henry everything he needs to know. It's another girl, another disappointment, another failure. And Henry's reaction? He doesn't even try to hide his disgust. While Catherine is literally bleeding and exhausted from childbirth, Henry announces to the court that this is just better luck next time for getting a son. Can you imagine your own father announcing to the world that your birth was basically a practice round for the real thing? But here's what makes this even more heartbreaking. Catherine of Aragon had already suffered through at least 6 failed pregnancies before Mary was born. 6 babies that either died in the womb, during birth, or shortly after. The royal nursery at Greenwich Palace was like a haunted house, filled with tiny coffins, unused cradles, and the ghosts of children who never got to grow up. Catherine would walk through those rooms every day, seeing reminders of every baby she'd lost, every hope that had been crushed. And now, finally, she had a living child, a beautiful, healthy daughter. But instead of celebration, instead of joy, Mary's birth was treated like a consolation prize. Henry barely looked at her for the first few weeks of her life. He was already planning his next moves, already thinking about how to get rid of Catherine and find a wife who could give him sons. So Mary Tudor entered the world unwanted, unloved, and seen as nothing more than a biological failure. And trust me, it only gets worse from here, because Henry VIII had plans for his daughter that would make your skin crawl. By the time Mary was 2 years old, she was already being used as political currency. Henry was arranging marriages for her like she was a piece on a chessboard, not a living, breathing child. Her first betrothal ceremony happened when she was barely walking. Picture a toddler in a tiny wedding dress, having no idea that her father was literally selling her future to foreign diplomats. In 1518, when Mary was just 2, Henry arranged for her to marry the Dauphin of France. There was an actual ceremony where this little girl had to stand still while grown men discussed her future like she was livestock. Then that engagement was broken off, and she was promised to her cousin Charles, who was already a grown man. Then that was canceled, and she was engaged to someone else. By the time Mary turned 16, she had been engaged and unengaged so many times that she probably didn't even know which foreign prince she was supposed to marry anymore. Can you imagine the psychological damage this was doing to a child? From the moment she could understand language, Mary was being told that her only value was as a wife to whoever could benefit her father politically. She wasn't a person with thoughts and feelings. She was property to be traded, sold, and disposed of when she was no longer useful. And the whole time this was happening, Catherine of Aragon was desperately trying to get pregnant again, trying to give Henry the son that would secure Mary's position. Catherine was having miscarriage after miscarriage, each one more devastating than the last, while Mary watched her mother grow thinner, sadder, and more desperate with each failed pregnancy. Mary spent her childhood watching her mother slowly break apart from the pressure of producing a male heir, while simultaneously being told that her own worth was entirely dependent on who she married. Is it any wonder that this girl grew up with serious psychological issues? But if you think Mary's childhood was bad, wait until you hear what happened when she turned 17, because that's when Henry VIII decided to completely destroy his daughter's life in the most cruel and systematic way possible. In 1533, when Mary was 17 years old, Henry VIII did something so shocking, so absolutely brutal, that it would traumatize Mary for the rest of her life. He had his marriage to Catherine of Aragon annulled, married Anne Boleyn, and then, here's the kicker, he declared that Mary was no longer a princess. She was now officially illegitimate, a bastard with no claim to the throne and no royal privileges whatsoever. But Henry didn't stop there. Oh no, that would have been too merciful. Instead, he came up with a punishment so diabolical, so psychologically destructive, that it's honestly hard to believe it actually happened. He forced Mary, a 17-year-old girl who had been raised as a princess her entire life, to become a servant to her infant half-sister Elizabeth. Let me repeat that, so you understand exactly how insane this was. Mary, who had been a princess for 17 years, was now required to curtsy to a baby. She had to serve Elizabeth's meals, clean up after her, and, this is the part that's going to make you sick, she was forced to empty Elizabeth's chamber pot. A teenage princess was made to handle her baby sister's waste. And this wasn't a temporary punishment. This went on for 3 years. 3 years of daily humiliation. 3 years of being treated like dirt by people who previously would have been executed for even speaking disrespectfully to her. The servants who had once bowed to Mary were now ordering her around, hitting her when she didn't move fast enough, treating her like she was less than human. Anne Boleyn personally made sure that Mary's humiliation was as complete as possible. She would visit the nursery just to watch Mary perform her degrading tasks, smiling while this broken teenager emptied chamber pots and scrubbed floors. Anne even made Mary eat with the lowest servants in the household, far away from the royal dining room where she had once sat as a princess. But perhaps the cruelest part of Mary's punishment was that she was completely separated from her mother during this time. Catherine of Aragon, the only person in the world who truly loved Mary, was locked away in a remote castle and forbidden from seeing her daughter. So Mary was going through this psychological torture completely alone, with no one to comfort her, no one to tell her that she was still valuable, still loved. The physical effects of this trauma were immediate and severe. Mary began suffering from chronic headaches that would plague her for the rest of her life. Her menstrual cycle became irregular and painful, something that would later contribute to her phantom pregnancies. She lost weight, developed stomach problems, and started having what we would now recognize as panic attacks. But the psychological damage was even worse. For 3 years, every single day, Mary was told through actions and words that she was worthless, that she deserved to be treated like garbage, that her previous life as a princess had been a lie. She was systematically broken down, her self-esteem demolished, her sense of identity completely destroyed. And here's what makes this even more twisted. Henry VIII was doing this to his own daughter. This wasn't some enemy prisoner being tortured for information. This was a father deliberately psychologically destroying his child because she reminded him of his failed marriage to Catherine of Aragon. Mary became the target for all of Henry's rage, disappointment, and guilt about not having a male heir. By the time this torture ended in 1536, when Anne Boleyn was executed and Mary was somewhat restored to the line of succession, the damage was done. The sweet, innocent princess was gone, replaced by a traumatized, angry, broken young woman who would spend the rest of her life trying to prove that she was worthy of love and respect. But here's where the story takes an absolutely shocking turn, because in 1553, something happened that no one saw coming. When Mary's younger brother Edward VI died at age 15, leaving no male heirs, the crown should have gone to Mary according to Henry's will. But the Protestant nobles had other plans. They tried to put Lady Jane Grey on the throne instead, thinking that Mary would just accept being passed over again like she always had before. They were wrong. Dead wrong. The broken, traumatized woman who had spent years emptying chamber pots suddenly transformed into a military commander. Within 1 week of Edward's death, Mary had gathered 15,000 armed supporters at Framlingham Castle and was ready to fight for her birthright. The same woman who had been forced to curtsy to a baby was now commanding armies and making strategic decisions that would determine the fate of England. This transformation was so sudden, so complete, that it caught everyone off guard. Lady Jane Grey, who had been queen for 9 days, was quickly abandoned by her supporters when they realized that Mary wasn't going to back down. Without a single battle being fought, Mary had won the throne through sheer force of personality and legitimate claim to power. But this victory came with a price, because the traumatized princess who had been systematically broken down for years was now the most powerful person in England. And she had a lot of anger, a lot of pain, and a lot of revenge fantasies that she was finally in a position to act on. The first sign that Mary's reign was going to be different came when she had to deal with Wyatt's rebellion in 1554. Instead of hiding in her palace like most monarchs would do, Mary personally rode out to meet her troops and gave a speech that was so powerful, so commanding, that it turned the tide of the battle before it even began. This was not the same broken girl who had been emptied chamber pots. This was a woman who had been through hell and emerged stronger, angrier, and absolutely determined to never be humiliated again. But Mary's transformation from victim to ruler created new problems, because now she had power, but she still had all the psychological damage from her childhood. She was still desperate for love, still traumatized by years of abuse, still carrying all that anger and pain with nowhere to direct it. And that's when she made a decision that would define her reign and ultimately destroy her legacy. She decided to get married. In 1554, at the age of 38, Mary Tudor announced that she was going to marry Philip of Spain, who was 11 years younger than her. Now, this wasn't unusual for royal marriages. Most of them were political arrangements anyway. But what made this different was that Mary had convinced herself that this was going to be a real love story, that Philip was going to be the husband who would finally give her the love and validation she had been craving her entire life. She could not have been more wrong. When Philip arrived in England and saw Mary for the first time, his reaction was visible to everyone in the room. Disgust, complete and utter disappointment. Mary was 38 years old, had suffered through years of physical and psychological trauma, and looked every bit her age. Philip, meanwhile, was 27, handsome, and had been expecting to marry someone who could at least pretend to be attractive. The wedding ceremony itself was one of the most awkward events in royal history. Mary was beaming with joy, convinced that she was finally getting her fairy tale ending, while Philip stood beside her, looking like he was attending his own funeral. Witnesses described his expression as barely concealed revulsion, and several noted that he seemed to be fighting the urge to run away. But the real horror began on their wedding night and continued throughout their entire marriage. Philip made no effort whatsoever to hide his disgust with Mary. He would barely touch her, spoke to her only when absolutely necessary, and spent most of his time making plans to leave England as soon as possible. He treated their marriage bed like a chore to be completed as quickly as possible, and even then, only when political necessity demanded it. Mary, meanwhile, was desperately in love. She would follow Philip around the palace like a lovesick teenager, trying to get his attention, trying to make him smile, trying to convince herself that his coldness was just temporary. She would write him love letters that he would barely glance at before handing them off to servants. She would plan romantic dinners that he would eat in silence before excusing himself to spend me with his Spanish courtiers. The most heartbreaking part was that Mary blamed herself for Philip's rejection. She convinced herself that if she could just be a better wife, if she could just give him a son, if she could just make herself more attractive somehow, then he would eventually learn to love her. She had no idea that Philip had already decided she was worthless before he even met her, and that nothing she could do would ever change his mind. This rejection was particularly devastating for Mary, because it brought back all the trauma from her childhood. Once again, she was being told through actions that she wasn't good enough, that she was a disappointment, that she was unworthy of love. The same feelings of worthlessness that had been hammered into her during those 3 years of servitude came flooding back, except now she was the Queen of England, and there was nowhere to hide from the humiliation. But Philip's rejection of Mary had consequences that went far beyond just hurting her feelings, because Mary's desperate need for his love led to one of the most tragic and bizarre episodes in royal history, her phantom pregnancies. In September 1554, just a few months after her wedding, Mary announced that she was pregnant. The entire kingdom celebrated. Finally, the queen would have an heir, the succession would be secure, and Philip would have to stay in England to be with his child. Mary was absolutely glowing with happiness, convinced that this pregnancy would solve all her problems and make Philip love her. But as the months went by, something very strange started happening. Mary was showing all the signs of pregnancy. Her belly was growing. She was experiencing morning sickness. Her periods had stopped, but there was no baby. By the time she should have given birth, it became clear that something was seriously wrong. Mary had been experiencing what doctors now call pseudocysis, or phantom pregnancy. Her desperate psychological need to be pregnant, combined with the trauma she had experienced throughout her life, had actually convinced her body that she was carrying a child. Her stomach swelled, her breasts enlarged. She even felt what she believed were the baby's movements, but it was all in her mind. For 11 months, Mary believed she was pregnant. She made elaborate preparations for the birth, had nurseries prepared, announced the pregnancy to foreign courts, and spent every day talking to her baby and planning for their future together. The entire kingdom was waiting for the royal birth that would never come. When it finally became clear that there was no baby, the humiliation was absolutely devastating. Mary had to face the fact that her body had betrayed her, that her desperate need for Philip's love had literally driven her insane. The phantom pregnancy became a source of mockery throughout Europe, with foreign ambassadors writing home about the mad English queen who had imagined herself pregnant for nearly a year. But the worst part was Philip's reaction. Instead of showing any sympathy or understanding for what Mary had gone through, he used the failed pregnancy as an excuse to leave England immediately. He had done his duty by marrying her. He had tried to produce an heir, and now that it was clear Mary was either barren or insane, he was done with her. Philip's departure broke Mary's heart completely. She begged him to stay, promised him anything he wanted, even offered to make him King of England in his own right. But Philip was disgusted by her desperation and couldn't wait to get away from her. He left England in September 1555 and wouldn't return for over a year. Alone, humiliated, and abandoned once again, Mary fell into a deep depression. But this time, instead of just accepting her fate like she had as a child, she had power. She was the Queen of England, and she was going to make someone pay for all the pain she had endured. And that's when Bloody Mary was truly born. In February 1555, just as Philip was preparing to leave England, Mary began what would become known as the Marian persecutions, the systematic burning of Protestant heretics. Over the next 3.5 years, approximately 284 people would be burned alive on Mary's orders, earning her the nickname that would define her legacy forever. But here's what most people don't understand about Mary's persecution of Protestants. It wasn't really about religion, it was about revenge. Every Protestant she burned represented someone who had hurt her, humiliated her, or taken something away from her. The Protestant Reformation had been the excuse Henry used to divorce her mother and declare Mary illegitimate. Protestants had supported Anne Boleyn, the woman who had tortured Mary for years. Protestants had tried to put Jane Grey on the throne instead of Mary. In Mary's damaged mind, Protestants were the source of all her suffering, and now she finally had the power to make them pay. The burnings began with John Rogers, a Protestant preacher who was burned at Smithfield on February 4th, 1555. But Mary wasn't content to just order the execution. She wanted to watch. She had a special viewing platform built so she could see the flames, hear the screams, and witness the suffering of her enemies. And according to witnesses, she enjoyed every moment of it. The most notorious burning was that of Hugh Latimer and Nicholas Ridley in October 1555. These were elderly men, respected scholars who had served the church faithfully for decades, but they were Protestants, which in Mary's mind made them guilty of everything she had suffered. As the flames consumed them, Latimer reportedly said to Ridley, "Be of good comfort, Master Ridley, and play the man. We shall this day light such a candle by God's grace in England as I trust shall never be put out." He was right. The candle of Protestant resistance that Mary was trying to extinguish with fire only burned brighter with each execution. Instead of terrorizing people into converting to Catholicism, the burnings made Mary increasingly unpopular and turned public opinion against her. But Mary was beyond caring about public opinion. She was trapped in a cycle of trauma and revenge that she couldn't break free from. Every time Philip rejected her, every time she felt unloved or humiliated, she would order more burnings. The Protestant victims became her outlet for all the rage and pain she had been carrying since childhood. The most heartbreaking aspect of Mary's reign of terror was that she genuinely believed she was doing God's work. In her mind, she was saving England from heresy, restoring the true faith, and honoring her mother's memory by undoing everything that Henry and his Protestant supporters had done. She couldn't see that she had become the monster that everyone said she was. By 1557, Mary was completely isolated. Philip remained in Spain, showing no interest in returning to England or his wife. The English people feared and hated her. Her own counselors were afraid to contradict her orders for more executions. She was the most powerful person in England, but she was utterly alone, and that's when Mary experienced her second phantom pregnancy. Once again, Mary convinced herself that she was carrying Philip's child. Once again, she made preparations for a birth that would never come. But this time, there was less fanfare, less celebration. People had learned not to get their hopes up, and many suspected that the Queen was losing her grip on reality. This second phantom pregnancy was even more devastating than the first, because Mary was now 41 years old and beginning to understand that she would never have children. Her body had betrayed her twice, her husband despised her, and her subjects feared her. Everything she had hoped for, everything she had sacrificed for, had turned to ashes. By early 1558, it became clear that Mary was seriously ill. What her physicians called dropsy was actually likely ovarian cancer, and it was killing her slowly and painfully. Her body began swelling with fluid, her skin took on a dark, unhealthy color, and she developed a terrible odor that could be detected from rooms away. But even as Mary's body was failing, her mind was creating one last cruel fantasy. She began having hallucinations of children playing in her chambers, laughing and calling her mother. She would have long conversations with these phantom children, planning games and activities, completely unaware that she was talking to empty air. Her servants were terrified. The woman who had burned nearly 300 people alive was now sitting in her rooms, talking to invisible children while her body literally rotted around her. The smell became so bad that courtiers would make excuses to avoid being in the same room with her. Even her doctors could barely stand to examine her. Philip, meanwhile, remained in Spain. Even as reports reached him that his wife was dying, he showed no interest in returning to England to comfort her in her final days. The man Mary had loved desperately, the man she had tried hard to please, couldn't even be bothered to pretend to care about her death. On November 17, 1558, Mary Tudor died at St. James's Palace. She was 42 years old, and her final words were reportedly about the children she saw playing around her bed. Even in death, her mind was creating the family she had always wanted, but never been able to have. But Mary's humiliation didn't end with her death, because even her funeral was designed to erase her memory and minimize her importance. Mary had specifically requested to be buried next to her mother, Catherine of Aragon, so that they could finally be reunited in death after being separated for so many years in life. It was her final wish, her last attempt to find some peace after a lifetime of suffering. Her request was denied. Instead, Mary was given a minimal funeral compared to other Tudor monarchs, and she was buried in Westminster Abbey in a simple tomb with barely any ceremony. For 44 years, she lay in an unmarked grave, while her half-sister Elizabeth's reign was celebrated as the golden age of English history. When Elizabeth died in 1603, both queens were placed in the same tomb, but even this final resting place became another humiliation for Mary. The monument that was eventually built honors only Elizabeth, with elaborate carvings and praise for Gloriana, while Mary's name is barely mentioned. Elizabeth is remembered as the Virgin Queen who defeated the Spanish Armada and ushered in an age of prosperity and cultural achievement. Mary is remembered only as Bloody Mary, the evil queen who burned heretics. The irony is almost too cruel to comprehend. Mary's suffering, Mary's trauma, Mary's desperate attempts to prove herself worthy of love, all of it created the conditions that allowed Elizabeth to become one of England's greatest monarchs. Elizabeth learned from watching Mary's mistakes, benefits, and from the religious conflicts Mary had tried to resolve through violence, and built her legendary reign on the foundation of Mary's failures. Elizabeth got everything that Mary had wanted: the love of her people, recognition as a great ruler, a legacy that would last for centuries. Meanwhile, Mary became a cautionary tale, a monster in history books, remembered only for the worst things she had done, while all the trauma that had created those actions was forgotten. But here's what I want you to understand as we reach the end of this absolutely heartbreaking story. Mary Tudor wasn't born evil. She wasn't some naturally sadistic person who enjoyed causing pain. She was a little girl who was systematically broken by the people who should have protected her, traumatized by experiences that would have destroyed anyone's psychological health, and then given unlimited power to act on that trauma. The woman whose skin turned black as she died, whose body rotted from the inside out, whose mind created phantom children to comfort her in her final days. That woman was created by a system that treated children as political pawns, women as breeding machines, and human beings as disposable tools for gaining power. Mary's story is ultimately about what happens when trauma is left untreated, when pain is used as a weapon, and when broken people are given the power to break others. She became the monster that her childhood experiences had programmed her to become, and then she was remembered only for the monstrous things she did, not for the monstrous things that had been done to her. The princess who was forced to empty chamber pots became the queen who burned people alive, but they were the same person. A traumatized woman who never learned how to heal from her pain and instead passed it on to others. And that might be the most tragic part of all, because in a different world, with different parents, different experiences, different support systems, Mary Tudor could have been remembered as one of England's greatest queens instead of its most feared. She had intelligence, determination, and the ability to command loyalty and respect. But all of that potential was twisted and corrupted by years of systematic abuse that no child should ever have to endure. So the next time you hear someone mention Bloody Mary, remember that behind that nickname was a real person who suffered in ways that are almost impossible to imagine, who was broken and rebuilt into something terrible, and who died alone, unloved, and unmourned, despite being one of the most powerful people in the world. Mary Tudor's skin may have turned black before she died, but her soul had been darkened by trauma long before her body began to fail. And that's a tragedy that goes far beyond any single reign, any single monarch, or any single period in history. It's a tragedy about what we do to children, how we create the monsters we fear, and how pain can perpetuate itself across generations if we don't find ways to break the cycle. The most evil queen in English history was also its most tragic victim, and that contradiction tells us more about power, trauma, and the human capacity for both cruelty and suffering than any other story I can think of. Mary Tudor lived in hell for 42 years, and for 3.5 of those years, she made sure that hell had company. But understanding her story, really understanding it, means recognizing that the line between victim and villain is often much thinner than we'd like to believe, and that sometimes the people who cause the most harm are the ones who have been harmed the most themselves. Mary Tudor's legacy isn't just about the people she killed, it's about the child she once was, and how that child's suffering echoed through history long after she was gone. That's the real story of Bloody Mary. Not just the queen who burned heretics, but the princess who was forced to serve as a maid, the wife who was rejected and humiliated, the woman who created phantom pregnancies because her need for love was so desperate that it convinced her body to lie to her. She was all of these people at once, and they all died together in that room at St. James's Palace, talking to children who existed only in her traumatized mind. And if that's not the most heartbreaking villain origin story in history, I don't know what is. The woman who was so evil that her skin turned to coal before she died was also the little girl who just wanted her father to love her, the teenager who was broken by years of abuse, the wife who was rejected by the only man she ever loved, and the queen who never learned that power couldn't heal the wounds that had been carved into her soul. Mary Tudor got her revenge, but she never got her healing. She got her throne, but she never got her happiness. She got her place in history, but she never got the love she had been searching for her entire life. And maybe that's the most terrifying thing of all, that someone can have everything the world considers valuable and still die as broken and alone as they lived. Mary Tudor had unlimited power, immense wealth, and the ability to command armies, but she couldn't command love, couldn't heal her trauma, and couldn't escape the prison that her childhood had built around her heart. So remember Mary Tudor, not just as Bloody Mary, the monster who burned people alive, but as the little girl who deserved better, the teenager who survived torture, the woman who loved desperately and was rejected completely, and the queen who died surrounded by phantom children because her mind couldn't bear the reality of dying alone. Her story is a warning about what we do to children, how we treat trauma, and what happens when broken people are given power over others. But it's also a reminder that behind every monster is a human being who was hurt so badly that they couldn't find any other way to exist in the world. Mary Tudor's skin turned black before she died, but her heart had been blackened by trauma decades earlier. And that, more than any execution or persecution, is the real tragedy of her story. That a child who should have been protected was instead destroyed, and that destruction echoed through history in ways that are still being felt today. The queen who was so evil that her skin turned to coal before she died was also the most tragic figure in English royal history, and both of those things are true at the same time. Understanding that contradiction is the key to understanding not just Mary Tudor, but human nature itself, how we create the very monsters we fear, and how trauma can turn victims into villains in ways that are both predictable and heartbreaking. That's the real story of Bloody Mary. Not just about the evil she did, but about the evil that was done to her, and how one led inevitably to the other in a cycle of pain that consumed everyone it touched. Mary Tudor lived in hell, died in hell, and made sure that plenty of other people joined her there. But she didn't choose to go to hell in the first place. She was sent there as a child, and she never found her way out. And if that doesn't make you think differently about monsters, villains, and the stories we tell about people we've decided are evil, then maybe you need to listen to this story again, because Mary Tudor's life contains lessons about humanity that are more important than any single historical event or royal biography. She was the queen whose skin turned black before she died, but she was also the princess who deserved love, protection, and healing instead of trauma, abuse, and abandonment. Both versions of Mary Tudor are real, both matter, and both tell us something crucial about what we're capable of as human beings, for better and for worse. The most evil queen in English history was created by the very people who later condemned her for being evil, and that irony is so profound, so tragic, and so relevant to understanding human nature that it deserves to be remembered long after the specific details of her reign have been forgotten. Mary Tudor got her revenge, but the cost was her soul. She got her throne, but lost her humanity. She got her place in history, but it was as a monster, rather than as the victim she had always been. And maybe that's the most important lesson of all, that getting revenge, gaining power, and making others pay for what they've done to you might feel satisfying in the moment, but it doesn't heal the wounds that created the need for revenge in the first place. Mary Tudor spent her entire adult life trying to make others feel the pain she had always carried, but she died in just as much pain as she had lived, surrounded by hallucinations because reality had always been too cruel for her to bear. The queen whose skin turned black before she died teaches us that becoming a monster doesn't stop you from being a victim. It just means you're a victim who now victimizes others. And that cycle continues until someone finds the courage to break it, something Mary Tudor never managed to do. Her story is about power, trauma, revenge, and the human capacity for both incredible cruelty and incredible suffering. But most of all, it's about what happens when we fail to protect children, fail to heal trauma, and fail to recognize that the monsters we create are often the victims we abandoned. Mary Tudor deserved better than the life she got, and the people she killed deserved better than the death she gave them. Both of those things are true, and both matter. And understanding that complexity is what makes her story so powerful and so relevant even 500 years later. The woman who was so evil that her skin turned to coal before she died was also one of history's greatest victims, and she died without ever understanding the difference. That's the real tragedy of Mary Tudor. Not just that she suffered, but that she never learned how to stop suffering, and so she made sure that others suffered too. And that pattern, that cycle of pain creating more pain, is still happening today in ways both large and small, which is why Mary Tudor's story matters not just as history, but as a warning about what we're still doing to children, how we're still failing to heal trauma, and how we're still creating the very monsters we claim to fear. The queen who was so evil that her skin turned to coal before she died has been dead for almost 500 years, but the forces that created her are still alive and still turning victims into villains every single day. Mary Tudor's story is a mirror that reflects not just the cruelty of the past, but the cruelty we're still capable of in the present. And until we learn the lessons her life has to teach us about trauma, power, and the crucial importance of protecting children from the adults who are supposed to love them, we'll keep creating new versions of Bloody Mary. People so broken by their experiences that they can only find meaning in breaking others. That's the legacy of Mary Tudor, not just the people she killed, but the warning she represents about what happens when we fail to heal the wounded children who grow up to become powerful adults. Her skin turned to coal before she died, but her heart had been turned to coal decades earlier by people who should have known better. And that's a tragedy that goes far beyond any single queen, any single reign, or any single moment in history. It's a tragedy about human nature itself, and our seemingly endless capacity to hurt the people we should protect, and then act surprised when those people grow up to hurt others in return. Mary Tudor's story is a horror story, but it's also a love story. The story of a little girl who desperately wanted to be loved, and who spent her entire life trying to earn that love in ways that ultimately destroyed both her and the people around her. She never got the love she needed, but